The first Latin boom in Hollywood was perhaps one of the most impressive ones. There was a bundle of actors who owned the screen with their charisma. Some of them I have mentioned in previous videos, such as Dolores del Rio, who started in a bunch of leading roles playing a range of different characters, including a French woman, a Russian, a Brazilian heiress, and a Polynesian princess, not to mention other Latin women. She was one of the few Latin actors who was given the chance to play otherized non-Anglo characters, a trend that expands between the 1920s to the 1960s. In addition to Del Rio, we had her real-life cousin Ramon Navarro, whose real name was José Ramón Gil Samaniego, who played the title role in Ben-Hur in 1926, a major blockbuster of its time in the silent era. Navarro starred in a number of other films, even acting opposite Norma Shearer, Joan Crawford, and doing some talking with his melodious speaking voice alongside Greta Garbo in Mata Hari, one of the few times he actually got to use it and record it. Alongside this boom, stereotypes about non-white people, and of course that doesn't exclude Latinx, started to take shape. Let's start with the ones not so detrimental. As you may surmise, one of the most famous was the Latin lover. It started with this man, a Spaniard by the name of Antonio Moreno, deemed the true architect of the Latin lover role. Quote, because of his dark features and expressive face which read well on the camera, he was considered a natural for early films being produced under difficult conditions and with primitive equipment, wrote Julie Chapa. Funny enough, the Latin lover did not originate from Latins themselves. Europeans gave shape to this Latin image. Whereas Moreno is the architect of the Latin lover, we may say that Rudolph Valentino was the founder. Valentino, who was Italian, passed away in 1926. He was known for his distant personal style, wearing makeup, his refined European taste, and for being perceived as sexually ambiguous. People thought he was gay and that he was involved in sham marriages to cover up his sexuality. There were claims of bigamy and unconsummated marriage, and that his first wife was lesbian. Despite of everything, women went crazy over him. You can even see the swarms of women attending his funeral, and legend has it that some of his female fans committed suicide after learning of his passing. From the moment Valentino appeared in The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, a story of the effect of World War I on young Argentinian men, in which he seductively dances with a woman, he was a star. Studio heads dubbed Valentino Latin lover as an explanation to his persona. The Latin lover suddenly became a thing in Hollywood, as his roles negotiated the foreign promise of smoldering sexuality, since only foreigners had sex, with the all-American Midwestern wild-ish white Anglo-Saxon Protestant promise of honorable manhood and two-fist manhood, wrote Michael Barrett. Upon the death of Rudolph Valentino the following year, Navarro inherited Valentino's Latin lover mantle. For Latin Americans in the 1920s, the Latin lover evoked sensual sights, and as opposed to the bandit and the greaser who were depicted as non-whites, as racialized others, the Latin lover could potentially be assimilated and become white. His trademark was a swarthy complexion, narrow lips, dark hair, and passionate eyes, and whereas greasers had been forbidden to have sexual relations with white women on screen, the Latin lover could sometimes win the hand of his white female lead. Rarely during this period did an actual Latin American actor play a Latin lover. Instead, he might be Italian, as was Valentino, or Spaniard, as was Antonio Moreno, or even Hungarian, as was Ricardo Cortés, born Jacob Krantz. Thus, Navarro was a rare screen presence. Still, although he was often identified as a Latin lover during his silent film career, Navarro never played a Latino. Rather, that notion was based on his Mexican background and popularized by the media, wrote Ernesto Chavez. But not so fast. There was another perhaps unwilling candidate who was just on the verge of rising to stardom to fill that Latin lover void around the time of Valentino's passing. That actor who was perhaps, you may say, cursed by his good looks was Mexican actor Gilbert Roland, whose real name was Luis Antonio Damaso de Alonso. He coincidentally got a part in The Midshipman in 1925, which also starred Navarro. Navarro's family had known Gilbert Roland's family before they and Navarro moved out of Mexico. When Gilbert started in his first leading roles in 1926, The Blonde Saint and later Camille, both films which are not available to the public due to preservation issues, it was somehow a double-edged sword because while it guaranteed larger roles in movies, often the lead role, it also meant that he would spend a good deal of time playing stereotypical Latin lovers. The real was the stereotypical dark lady, which, according to Charles Ramirez Burke, whom I am going to be mentioning a lot throughout this video, as he is one, or I should say, the scholar on Latin stereotypes. So, according to Ramirez Burke, in Latin Images in Film, Stereotypes, Subversion, and Resistance, a dark lady is a, quote, female Latin lover who is virginal, inscrutable, aristocratic, and erotically appealing precisely because of these characteristics. Her cool distance is what makes her fascinating to Anglo males. He adds, in comparison with Anglo women, she is circumspect and aloof, where her Anglo sister is direct and forthright, reserved where the Anglo female is boisterous, opaque where the Anglo woman is transparent. In films like Flying Down to Rio Caliente, Del Rio played the fascinating Latin woman who basically made all the American leading men go horny. I mean, she became the first female to wear this on screen. This was pre-code. But the dark lady is the female Latin lover, or the Latin lover is the male dark lady, whichever way you want to put it. The kernel for the existence of the dark lady, according to Ramirez Burke, was roughly the saying, quote, by making both the Latin lover and the dark lady embodiments of sexual characteristics manifestly lacking in the Anglo, Hollywood stereotype and marginalized by idealization. At the same time, Del Rio was perceived as an ambassador instead of an immigrant. Joan Hirschfeld in The Invention of Dolores del Rio argues that Del Rio was often characterized as Spanish or Latin, tracing a quasi-European pedigree that implicitly erased or denigrated the mestizo Mexican majority. The closer the actor got to pass as white and European, the less denigrating the stereotype was. Rita Hayworth, or Margarita Carmen Cancino, whom I have mentioned in another video too, at the beginning of her career played a raven-haired dark lady. It wasn't until she married businessman Edward Hudson, who helped her see that being a Hispanic limited her to work as a cinematic loose woman, that she changed her image and her name. Hayworth was transformed from the dark lady to an auburn-haired love goddess, writes Ballady Menard. Good or bad stereotypes, at the end of the day, they were that. Even quote-unquote positive stereotypes, they're still overgeneralized simplifications that depict the other as outside the acceptable, Ramirez Burke writes. In American movies, these positive Hispanic stereotypes have typically taken two forms, the Latin lover and the dark lady. So what are some of the most detrimental and just bad stereotypes? The first Latina Spitfire was Lupe Vélez, often focused on the comedy of errors created by intercultural miscommunication and the comedic tensions inherent in the romantic relationship between the Latina star and her white U.S. paramour. Vélez portrayals in a series of Mexican Spitfire movies generated the popular Latina stereotype, very similar to the show I Love Lucy, although Vélez movies came first and it might have had an influence later for the Lucy show. What remains the same is that both productions have a Latin Anglo couple. Lucy switches the gender of the Latinx and the Anglo character, but the Latinx partner has a similar Spitfire clownish attitude. Vélez, considered a B-movie actress, speaks with a heavy accent, and when she's annoyed, she bursts into uttering rapid-fire Spanish. Her image was oversexed and overly emotional. Her personal life often drew intertextual themes into her work. Known for her volatile personal life, at one point she dated actor Gary Cooper, whom she attacked with a knife on more than one occasion. Cooper even needed stitches once. This behavior is reflected on Bella's characters even before her Spitfire role in the 1940s. Her characters are wont to have tantrums and, quote, often literally throwing objects across a room or pulling weapons on the men they love, writes Victoria Stuttervant. Her immigrant roots are part of her characters too. Sturdivant says, quote, Bella's films often acknowledge her position as a trickster, a woman who is constantly in the process of disguising and transforming her identity. She adds, Bella's therefore represents an ambivalent vision of immigrant identity, one that acknowledges the limitations of the American fears about ethnic pollution while simultaneously offering a subversive outsider's vision of Anglo-feminine values like restraint, sexual passivity, and the performance of helplessness. She was much closely identified with Mexico, deemed the Mexican Spitfire, the Mexican Moonson, or the Mexican Pepperpot. Bella's den was part of a more nationally specific Mexican class of immigrants, more threatening and debased, far closer to the United States' more fetishized, culturally and legally problematic border, threatening cultural intrusion and a drain on the resources and dominance of the Anglo majority. She therefore had to be funny in order to show white people that Mexicans weren't threatening. Unlike Del Rio, who was usually characterized as languid and exotic, Bella's was shown in her films and in her publicity trying unsuccessfully to assimilate into American codes of conduct. For example, lighting her hair, marrying an ill American athlete, buying a big convertible. Yet the more she made America her home, the more Bella's was coded as a polluting outsider aggressively storming the gates rather than preserving her clean fetishized status as an exotic ambassador. The Spitfire was also referred to as the female clown. The ideological role of the Spitfire archetype was to make foreign Latin America less threatening through humor while celebrating the potential for intercultural exchange and heterosexual romance, writes Isabel Molina Guzman. One of those less threatening, seemingly harmless female clowns was Carmen Miranda. Ramirez Berg writes, Miranda's multicolored costumes and fruit-covered hats worn in splashy Latin musical numbers were an instant parody of the folkloric costumes and costumes of Latin America. Portuguese Miranda, despite her melodious singing, she's always the same character, which exaggerates to draw laughter in what is a campy example of a good neighbor policy that was the United States and Hollywood's interest to foster during World War II in the 1940s.
Well, there's your good neighbor policy.
U.S. President then Franklin D. Roosevelt's pro-Latin American foreign policy surfaced when the European market was unavailable because of the war, and the U.S. wanted to make sure their neighbor countries, Canada and Mexico, were on their side so to avoid events like the installation of an army base or something else warfare. It was also the time of the Bracero program, which encouraged Mexican farm laborers to come north and work as replacements for Americans who fought in the war. Latinos had romantic Latin roles and positive roles, but that lasted for about 6 or 7 years, and then we went back to the greasy roles. And like the Latin lover and the dark lady, the female clown also has its equivalent, its doppelganger. That is the Melville Fawn. Ramirez Berg cites examples such as Pancho in The Cisco Kid, Sergeant Garcia in Walt Disney's Zorro, and Ricky Ricardo in I Love Lucy, saying, comedy is a way of dealing with the Hispanic males and the Hispanic females' stereotypical accentuated differences, a way of taming their fearful qualities. They can be simple-minded, fail at mastering a standard English, and can be emotionally immature. And if there is equivalent for every stereotype, the dark lady happens also to have a foil, which Ramirez Berg calls the half-bred harlot. It's usually a woman who is described as lusty and hot-tempered and to provide as much sexual titillation as current censorship standards will permit. She is described as a slave to her passions, having an uncontrollable and insatiable thirst for sex. In other words, she is a prostitute because she likes to work, not because social or economic forces have shaped her life. And of course, I am not going to forget mentioning El Bandido, the bandit. In early silent films, many of which concentrated on violence and action, Mexicans often play roles as bandits and were often described as greasers. This stereotype character robbed, murdered, plundered, raped, cheated, gambled, and lied. Films such as Tony the Greaser, Bronco Billy and the Greaser, and The Greaser's Revenge perpetuated deep-seated racism against Mexicans. The Mexican Revolution reinforced these violent stereotypes, and the revolutionary leader Pancho Villa himself signed a contract with the Mutual Film Corporation to record in film his exploits in the 1913 war in Mexico. According to Ramirez Burke, the Bandido's roots go back to the villains of the silent greaser films, and he continued to appear in many westerns. Ramirez Burke provides perhaps the best description of who and what a bandido is. Quote, typically, he is a treacherous, shifty, and dishonest. His reactions are emotional, irrational, and usually violent. His intelligence is severely limited, resulting in flawed strategies. He is dirty and unkempt, usually displaying an unshaven face, missing teeth, and disabled, oily hair. His inability to speak English with a heavy accent is Hollywood's way of signaling his feeble intellect, a lack of brain power that makes it impossible for him to plan or strategize successfully. The Bandit was conceived out of the Mexican Revolution. Again, Ramirez Burke writes, beneath the stereotype does lie a kernel of truth. Some Mexicanos did in fact look like this once upon a time, and violence was part of their life. That of the unkempt appearance, the weaponry, the sombrero, and the sneering look, but the stereotypes don't convey the truth. Most of the men who dressed like this were not bandits. They were rebel soldiers who fought in the Mexican Revolutionary War of 1910 to 1920. For starters, then Hollywood's use replacement of these figures in the American West of the 1880s is historical, inaccurate, and anachronistic. Furthermore, in the Mexican experience, these men were the good guys who fought against the despotic dictator Porfirio Diaz under the leaders like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata. Even their sombreros have a positive signification in that they were ingenious adaptations to a harsh environment, allowing the wearer to carry his shade with him. The Latin boom in the silent era seemed promising, but culminated in mostly dissolution. Thank our friend Mr. Sound. The silence of cinema in the first third of the 20th century allowed actors like Del Rio, Vélez, Roland, and Navarro to play a variety of characters of all kinds of nationalities and ethnicities. Sound required actors to speak English clearly, perhaps less foreign and more of the famous Fox transatlantic accent. British was the only other accent acceptable. It wasn't just Latins who paid the price, other foreigners too, like Hungarians. The careers of many of the Latin stars of the time faded away. Del Rio eventually returned to Mexico in 1943 after her partner, Orson Welles, left her for much younger than Rita Hayworth, and roles had dried out. Commenting on her departure, she said, I wish to choose my own stories, my own director and cameraman. I can accomplish this better in Mexico. Once in Mexico, Del Rio made memorable pictures like Maria Candelaria and The Unloved Woman, and she became a superstar of Mexican cinema. She had revisited the United States only on film-by-film basis. She had a bit of a mishap when the Hua Committee labeled her a communist and her visa was cancelled, but eventually she was able to set foot in the US once again to be Opie's mom in Flaming Star and starred in one of John Ford's films, Cheyenne Autumn. Gilbert Roland wasn't just a Latin lover. He did play his fair share of Latin lovers and perhaps, depending on the way you look at it, benefited from it, but this positive stereotypes afforded him the opportunity to play a range of other characters, playing Frenchmen and Arab roles. Nevertheless, in his last few years, he was mostly doing B-movies. Navarro and Vélez had more tragic endings, maybe even eerily Hollywood tragic endings type of thing. Navarro, tormented all his life by his homosexuality, was killed the night of October 30th of 1968 at the age of 69 by Hustler and his brother, the Ferguson brothers. His death led to his homosexuality become public. As for Bella, she kept doing B-movies until 1944. At the age of 36, she found herself pregnant. The dad was asshole Harold Raymond. Raymond agreed to marry her only if she signed a contract declaring that she understood he was consenting to marry her only to give a name to her child. Upset and enraged like her Spitfire characters, she called off the wedding. Her morals prevented her from having an abortion or even a child out of wedlock, so she chose to end her life instead. Covering her bed with roses and gardenias, she then took a seconal while wearing her silver lame evening gown. The seconal made her dizzy. She drowned while vomiting into the toilet and died. Other actors of the era like Lupita Tovar, Raquel Torres, and Moreno kept themselves afloat too doing B-movies. What didn't fade away was the stereotypes. In fact, if we look closely, they kept appearing. The Latin lover kept having successors like Ricardo Montalban, Fernando Lamas, and most recently, Antonio Banderas. We also have more than enough bandidos to spare. Some well portrayed while others, well, they do their best, but it's just endless TBH. Bandits resurfaced in the 60s when the civil rights movement was at its peak and it became complicated to show disparaging images of blacks. Latinx bandidos became the scapegoat, so to speak. The easy standstill. We still see Latin women being highly sexualized, just as a recent study by the Edinburgh School of Communications on ethnicity found that Latin women are the most sexualized ethnic group in film. Salma Hayek, Jennifer Lopez, Eva Mendes, Zoe Saldana. Sofia Vergara is a modern Spitfire who even said to have exaggerated her accent even more to play Gloria, which is a tool that I would dare to say Bella is a pioneer. The male Buffon of our time is Eugenio Derbez, Rosie Perez is a female clown, and West Side Story's Maria is the Dart Lady. The stereotypes were divided according to the actor's physical characteristics. There were a selected few who could alter their physical appearance, but that was based on the person's color and attractiveness, which were privileges for very few, and it determined the kinds of roles they play or the lack of. Ramirez Berg said that as the Latino boom ended, another stereotype immigrant group began its boom. They were the Irish. I know. It's easier for them, they speak English, and are mostly fair-skinned. He attributes this boom to the mass migration of Irish to the US, which began a century before sound came to the movies in 1927. By 1880, there were 5 million Irish Americans living in the US, which was 10% of the overall population from that moment. Their population has remained on double digits ever since. Sustaining critical mass, the Irish dispersed into all walks of life, including Hollywood. Quote, once the Irish reached 1/10 of the US population, they represented a significant demographic segment that wielded considerable purchasing power, no doubt making a perceptible difference at the box office. After having bad connotations attached to their national identity, the Irish affected their self-representation and artistic expression, with John Ford as a force of nature director becoming well known, especially for his Western films, and the only one to earn 4 Academy Awards for Best Director. They had famous actors like Spencer Tracy and Mickey Rooney, James Cagney, Aaron Finn, and John Wayne. Films like Singing in the Rain would not have been made, not because it was an explicit celebration of the Irish experience, but it has the energy and creativity of its Irish stars, Gene Kelly, who co-directed and starred alongside Donald O'Connor. Quote, the stereotyping of the Irish in Hollywood movies declined because once they reach and maintain a certain fraction of the national population, the 10% threshold, they existed as a considerable consumer base and substantial talent pool. they worked their way into the studio system and became key players in Hollywood, Ramirezberg writes. In contrast, Latinos were 1.1% of the total US population in the 1930s, which rendered the Latino boom to be mostly just a fad. Today, Latins make 18.5% of the population. Does that equal a second Latin boom in Hollywood? Only time will tell. Thanks for watching. For more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.